Christianity is only valid if it holds up on your worst day. The Bible was real honest, and Jesus promises us suffering, and so I think it's good to look at how did Jesus deal with that day. And so there is something to say what happens when you're crushed.
This is the Land in the Bible podcast. All right, we are in episode 5 of our Passion Week series in the Land in the Bible podcast. Today we are talking about
Gethsemane.
What do you have in store for us today?
Today we're talking about the Garden of Gethsemane,
Yep.
and we'll be talking about why it's a truly singular moment in the history of the universe, really. And then also, what can we learn from the characters in the story and how they're acting and what's going on.
That's cool. So who are the characters? Who are we looking at today?
So primary actors are, of course, Jesus, Peter, James, and John. Sort of sub actors, also a little bit in the story, is Judas. And the temple guard show, people like that too at the end.
Gotcha.
But really Jesus and the sort of the big three, Peter, James, and John.
Okay. All right. Well, go ahead and set us up.
All right. So what the Bible says is that Jesus and his disciples, down to 11 now, because Judas has departed to go off and do his betrayal bit. They leave the upper room. They cross the Kidron Valley. So they go from Jerusalem across the valley to the mountain opposite, which is the Mount of Olives. And that somewhere there along the mountain, they go to a garden. Now, when the New Testament talks about gardens, both where Jesus is buried and also here, it is not talking about a place with pretty flowers. They did not have the water resources to waste on something like that at that time. They couldn't just make a pretty garden like, oh, look, it's nice. It wasn't really done. So when the Bible talks about gardens, you're talking about agriculture. They're growing something, whether that's probably grapes, where Jesus was buried. Or here it's olives. Okay, it's an olive orchard. So when it talks about olives, it's a place of some sort of agriculture. The reason the Mount of Olives is called the Mount of Olives is because, well, olives grow on it.
Wow.
Till this day.
That's weird.
Yeah, and until this day, if you go to the traditional site of the Garden of Gethsemane, which really no one knows where the Garden of Gethsemane was. It could have been almost anywhere along the face of the mountain. We really have no textual clues. We know it was on the mountain and they were growing olives. Well, guess what? That was most of the mountain at the time. So, to say it was in the spot, that is commemorated till now, I think that's really outside of what we can know.
Yeah.
But it's good that the spot has been preserved because we've preserved some olive orchard there. In modernity, we have all the tombs on one end of the mountain. Then we have just massive population growth in other parts of the mountain where there's just lots of homes being built. And so it's good that some of the mountain has been preserved in a natural state with the olive orchards growing so we can see what the Bible is referring to. And so, hats off to the Catholic Church for keeping some of it like that.
Yeah.
So that's good. When you go there, you see the trees there. Some people will say that they are quote unquote Roman trees, meaning that these trees are, over 2,000 years old. I don't think that's true. I'm open to having my mind changed, so if there's a botanist out there who would like to verify, that sort of Palestinian olive trees can live beyond 2,000 years. I would love to hear it. I'm open to it.
Yeah.
But anything I've ever read says that they can make it about 1,300 years or so is where they cap out, which is still a really long life.
Yeah.
So some people will be like, these are the trees that were there when Jesus was here. I don't think that's true. I do think it's possible that they are the children of the trees that were there when Jesus was there, which is still pretty cool. It doesn't invalidate the site, but it does show us that there was olive growth going on in that area, which we know from the name of the mountain itself.
Right.
Going back to that time, specifically, Gethsemane means place of crushing. So that might have some meaning for the story.
Right.
Clearly from the name, that would also mean that there would have been an olive press there in all likelihood, so that the olives were pressed or crushed there.
Mm-hmm.
But then obviously also has meaning regarding Jesus, as this is a place of great trial, of his will being pressed and crushed, of him, sort of being forced, compelled, maybe a better word, to obedience by the Father, and him submitting. Hebrews says that he was perfected by obedience, that he's Jesus, so he wasn't flawed, but there was still something that made him better, that there was some development of him in his act of obedience there in the garden. So it's a place of crushing. Now, crushing is interesting. I think there's some symbolism there. And when an olive is crushed, assuming it's a good, healthy olive, then what comes out is oil, olive oil, which is a very good, very healthy thing. If you were to take a rotten or bad fruit and crush it, what would come out would be not so good.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's also something going on there with the name regarding about what's about to unfold, which is that Jesus is going, again, to be crushed. His will, he's going to accept to do something that he in himself clearly does not want to do. Now, he wants the result of it. He wants to be restored to right relationship with humanity, to people he loves. He wants to defeat, sin and death and hell and the grave and all that. Like, he wants the result, but does he want the process? Like, no. And then that's normal, right? I mean, I'd like to be a, Michael Jordan. I don't want to practice, 70 hours a week,
Right.
Like, it's normal to want the result, not the process,
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess that's where Jesus is, and we'll kind of see that unfold. But then he submits to the Father, saying, no, you need to do this. And, and a good, wonderful thing for humanity is the product,
Mm-hmm.
whereas if maybe someone not so good went through a similar process, the result might not be so good.
Right.
So I think there's something going on there with let's be honest. Christianity is only valid if it holds up on your worst day.
Right.
And all of us, and sort of getting ahead of myself here, but all of us are going to have this day. All of us are going to have the day when you get a diagnosis that you don't like, when you get news that you don't want to hear. And Christianity is only valid if on that day it holds up, and so there is something to say what happens when you're crushed, and we don't like to think about that. We want everything to be sunshine and roses and your best life. And we want that, but the Bible is real honest, and Jesus promises us suffering.
Right.
On this earth, bad things are going to happen to you. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to suffer. Bad things are going to happen. And so if, we're promised that, that's our reality. Well, then does your faith, does your philosophy, your guiding light, things you're living by, does it hold up on that day? Because that day is coming for all of us. And so I think it's good to look at, how did Jesus deal with that day? How did Jesus deal with the day when things were rough, real rough?
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm also getting way ahead of myself and all this, but one of the things I love about Christianity, if there are different philosophies out there in the world about dealing with pain and suffering, and also with joy and pleasure. And, if you look back at the ancient Greek world that Jesus was living in, you had ideas like stoicism, which was sort of like, keep a stiff upper lip, just, deal with it, suck it up, be a man,
Mm-hmm.
Try to be flat and level, and don't get real happy, don't get real sad, just be here. And you had later things like, like Gnosticism, which is basically like the flesh and the body are bad and the spirit's good. So the suffering in the body, like, who cares? Doesn't matter so much. So let's negate that. I think Christianity really embraces the idea that pain is real and pain hurts. And also pleasure is real, and nothing wrong with pleasure. The Bible says that there's 1,000 pleasures at God's right hand. That any pleasure you ever experience was created by God, right? And it's okay. It's okay to enjoy pleasure, and it's okay to say that pain hurts, and those things are real, So that just this is totally off track. Just as a side note regarding pleasures that came up. No pleasure is evil. It's created by God. Okay, so whether that's eating or sex or sleep or whatever your thing is,
right?
The problem is, as humans, we don't regulate them very well. We tend to become abusive and go too far into them, or we're too much, and we oversleep, or we undersleep, or we do things out of context or in wrong ways. We drink too much, and we get, the problem's not the pleasure. It's it's us not regulating things or doing them properly, but we don't think those things are bad. I think they're good. I think they're from the Lord, and pain is real. So, and we don't think that physical things, we're not Gnostics. We don't think that our body's bad and evil. No, God made our bodies, and he's going to redeem them one day and fix them, So we accept all those things. We embrace them. But then how do you deal with it? How do you deal with these things? And particularly, in the Garden of Gethsemane, how do you deal with intense, excruciating, real pain? Mental, physical, emotional. What do you do? Because that's a reality of life. And we don't think that you should just, sometimes the crucifixion is just portrayed as, Jesus sort of stoically, being beaten and killed. And I don't think it's true at all. I'm sure he cried out and he suffered. The pain was real, and that's okay. And I think that's part of what we're going to see. So, all right. So let's kind of delve in. To me, Gethsemane is important for a couple of reasons. First off, I don't think there is any other moment in really the history of the universe, eternity past to present to future, certainly biblically or that we know of, where the humanity of Christ comes more sharply into focus. That this is a man, deity, yes, God, yes, divine, yes, but he's also just a man also, and as a man, he doesn't want to go through what's around the corner. And who can blame him? What was around the corner was horrific. And you see him, his own words, in distress, sorrowful. He is struggling. He's under horrible, horrible duress. And you see him pushed to the absolute limit. This is why I say it's a unique moment in all of history, because how often in the history of the universe will God do something that's hard for him to do? How often will he be pressed?
Right.
Like, this is hard. His deity, this is hard.
Yeah.
That's not, you're talking about the being that created the universe and spoke them into, whatever. How often is he going to be pressed?
Yeah. Most of the things we see in Scripture are the opposite. Things just happen at his word. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So this is a real weird, sort of unique, singular moment that will never be repeated, So, all right. So that's interesting. It also, again, it makes him human. Hebrews 4:15 says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin." So the worst thing that you've been tempted with, pushed by, the worst pain, the worst hurt that you've experienced, the Lord's been there and didn't sin. He talks to the disciples and he says, you're going to go through all these bad things, but be encouraged because I've overcome the world. So the point is, not that you're going to suffer. He said, yeah, you're going to suffer, but I've already been through it and I did it well. So you can hold up and there'll be blessing on the other side of it. There's no promise to not suffer. And a lot of people just horribly, horribly abuse Romans 8:28. All things are together for the good of those who, it's going to work out for your good.
Yeah.
Well, okay. In an eternal perspective, that's true. But on this side of death, maybe not.
Right.
That is a scripture, and it's true. We embrace it, we love it, and it means that everything that ever happens to us happens for us, and that's awesome. But the reality of that scripture is it is an eternal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You may never get to the point where you understand or see that here. Sometimes things are just going to happen that are horribly, horribly rough. And the Bible's saying Jesus has been through it all, and he did well going through it. He made it to the other side, to resurrection and to life, and he's already at that point on the other side where it all worked out for the good, and we can get there too. Awesome. So let's set the background for the story. So Jesus takes the disciples and he goes to the tomb at the same time that to the garden. At the same time that he is moving to the garden, Judas has moved or is moving to find the priests, to find these sort of temple aristocrats, the Pharisees, and that crowd of guys, to find them and to take them to the garden to arrest Jesus. He knows where they're going. He knows what they do. He knows who Jesus is, what he looks like, what the disciples look like. He knows all the information. He's going to find the guys to get his 30 pieces of silver to go get Jesus. What was Jesus's perspective on Judas? And Jesus's perspective on Judas was that he loved him. Mm-hmm. They had worked together closely for 3 years. He loved him. In the upper room, he extends, sort of a final offer of a friend. He offers, to break food and wine with him. He's there. He knows what Jesus is going to do, but he still tries to extend, a last measure of kindness and goodness to him. And the last words that they exchange in the garden are very poignant to me. This is in Matthew 26:50. Jesus, when he sees Judas, he says, "Friend, why have you come?" And I just read that. I mean, Jesus knew why he was there. I read that as, and there's, anytime you read biblical text, mm-hmm. you have to think, what is the tone in which a thing is said? Because the tone in which a thing is said and the way it's said affect the meaning very heavily, right? Mm-hmm. So the best example of that to me is the verse where Jesus speaking to the disciples, and he says, "If you love me, you'll keep my commandments." Now, that exact phrase could be said as a weapon. So someone just sinned, and, Jesus could scoldingly be like, "If you love me, you keep my commandments." In other words, you obviously don't love me because you did this. You're like, right. That could be stated as quite the accusation. But if you read it in context, he says it because he's trying to encourage them. They can follow his commands. He's really saying hey, just work on loving me and then keep my commandments. Is going to flow out of that. So the tone in which the thing is said make a big difference, right? If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. It's an encouragement. It's not an accusation. Right. So tone really matters. And I in my head, and you can take it or leave it, I think when Jesus says this, it's just like, "Oh, Judas, why have you done this? Why have you come? My friend, why have you done this?" Because he's heartbroken for Judas, even though he's the one being portrayed. He looks at this man that he's loved, that he poured into, that he didn't want him to go down this path. And he's just like, oh, okay. And he's also being betrayed. And that's human. I mean, if you've lived on this earth for very long, you've probably had people that were supposed to love you and be your friends that treated you like garbage at some point. And that doesn't feel very good, right? So that's going on. Then what else is going on? So the betrayals in the swirl of as they approach the garden. The other thing that happens is that Jesus the pressure is growing on him. That moment in the upper room where he got to pour out love and care towards his disciples the last time, that moment is really over. And he's looking at being pulled away from those guys mm-hmm. and suffering alone. And the pressure of that and the anxiety and the fear of that. And some people don't want to use those words about Jesus, that he had a level of anxiety and fear. But I when you read the story, and it's hard to say anything other than that. And honestly, as a human, who would not? And if he's been tempted in all ways, wouldn't one of those things be, I'm scared and I want to back out?
Right.
Wouldn't one of those ways be, I'm really anxious about this? I don't, that's a part of how we're tempted.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So if he never felt that, then he wouldn't be what Hebrews 4 says he is, which is the high priest that understands our weaknesses. Mm-hmm. So I think he clearly is going through those things. And what makes Jesus wonderful, and what makes him in the end incredibly courageous and brave, is that he knows what's going to happen to him, and he still faces it. Mm-hmm. It's not that he never felt fear. It's that he felt fear and still walked forward. If you never feel fear, then you're not brave. You're just crazy. Right. I mean, you think about this in the, in terms of like World War II or something, like these guys on the boats going towards D-Day. Yeah. Well, if they didn't feel fear, they're just nuts. Right. But in the face of that fear, how do you act? I like that kind of history. I read the story one time of an old man from England who was interviewed near the end of his life. And he had survived World War I. And when you came out of the trenches and attacked the other trench, they called it, quote unquote, going over the top. You pour out of your trench and attack, And if a man did that, his chance of coming back unwounded was about 50%. So 50% of the people that went over the top were either killed or wounded. Mm-hmm. This guy participated in something like 10 or 11 assaults. Wow. Where he went over the top. So he took a 50% chance of getting killed or wounded over and over again. He miraculously lived. And he was interviewed late in his life, and he was asked, like, how did you get the courage? Maybe the first time you're just dumb, you don't know, but like by 7, 8, 9, you know what's about to happen. How did you ever have the courage to do that? And he said, well, every time that I had to go over the top, as I was laying there waiting for the whistle or the signal, he said, I would pray, Lord, help me act like a man for these next few minutes. That's it. So that was his secret. Lord, help me get through these next few minutes and act like a man. And that's not a horrible model, right? Like he knew it was ahead, and he prayed, God, help me, which that's a sort of a faint, modern echo of what Jesus is going through, right? Where he knows what's happening, he knows, and he's like, well, what does he do? We're going to get there. So Judas is betraying. Jesus is feeling the weight come crushing in. And so he invites his closest companions. Matthew 26, 37, 38 says, taking along Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Okay, get this. He's sorrowful. He's troubled. He's deeply sad. He's deeply upset. And he said to them, I am deeply grieved. Okay. Like you've got to get all that language. It's not hyperbole. Like sometimes we read words and we're just like, they just kind of bounce off of us. Right. Like you've got to understand, like he is deeply upset. He's deeply grieved. He's full of heavy negative emotion is all over him. He says, I am deeply grieved to the point of death. Okay, this is Jesus speaking. I am so sad. I am so overwhelmed by what is in front of me. I could just lay down and die right now. Mm-hmm. Okay? That's Jesus speaking. And then he says, remain here and stay awake with me. So I want you to get that. First off, in thinking through what do you do in a moment like that, I think one thing is to say you find 2 or 3 people who you really, really love and trust, and you do invite them into the moment, mm-hmm. because you're probably not going to get through it typically without some help. So I think Jesus is a good model for us in that. But from their perspective, I want you to just think about it for a second. These guys have known Jesus for, over 3 years, or about 3 years. For 3 years, he has been their provider, their protector, their savior, both spiritually and physically. I mean, Peter, got to walk on water because Jesus led him and then pulled him out. And they've seen him, break bread and, do miracles and heal people. And all of this stuff has gone down and they've seen it all. He's cared for them and loved them in every way possible. They've been vulnerable. They've been hurting. He's cared for them. He's never really needed them necessarily that much. He's wanted them and he's desired companionship with them, but it's not like he needed them for anything. And for one moment, like literally one moment in all of eternity, you've got God. We believe Jesus is God.
Right.
You have God wanting help, wanting someone to go with him through a thing.
Mm-hmm.
That will never happen again. That moment will never be here again.
Yeah.
Okay? And these 3 men, of all the humans that have ever lived or ever will live, had the opportunity to walk with Jesus through his most desperate moment. And for one shining, glimmering moment, or dark actually moment, in all of eternal history, where you have God saying, pray with me, walk with me through this, be with me, be awake with me through this, they have an opportunity to buoy him up instead of the opposite. He's always lifted them up. There's one chance that they'll ever have to lift him up. They just blow it. Yeah. It is hard to imagine a more abject failure in the entire history of mankind. Like really, like these guys, like, Peter, James, and John, they're the inner circle. Some people call them the big 3. They're the ones that, always get called in for the cool stuff. You had to think that like Thomas and James the Lesser and all these other guys had to be like, come on, Jesus, why don't we get to go? But these are the ones.
Yeah.
They're the inner circle. And it's their chance, and they blow it. And this is kind of how it goes down. Matthew 26:40, it says, and he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And I wakes up, hey guys, pray with me, please. Matthew 26:43, and he came again and found them sleeping because they could not keep their eyes open. And like what I want to say about this is, these aren't bad guys, and they love Jesus. They really, really love him. They just blow it. And that's pretty relatable, I think. Yeah. So like when we're going through, garbage and stuff in our lives, when we're at those moments that push us, our place of crushing, we are not better than Jesus. And it is likely that in those moments, in times of great need, that people who are our friends, who love us, will let us down.
Yeah.
And not provide the help and the support that we think that they should, and maybe in that they should, Mm-hmm. So it's not abnormal, but it's also not nice, Yeah. And for me, we've been talking about the characters in the story all throughout this. And, and again, if you read this and you think, and when you put yourself in the story, you put yourself in the story as Jesus, being let down by your friends at the worst moments of your life. Well, that's likely, it's possible. But you probably should read this story with you as James, John, and Peter, where you're the person who lets people down in the important moments of their life. And you're Judas, who betrays people for your own benefit. Right. If you think you're Jesus in the story, sometimes maybe on your best day, but you're the other guys too,
Yeah.
So I always find this incredibly challenging because they're not bad guys. They just don't care enough to stay awake.
Yeah.
They put their own needs in front of a far greater need of someone in their life. And for me, like as a husband and father, I find that it's incredibly challenging because I don't want to sleep through moments in the life of my wife and my kids, people around me. I don't want, and I'm sure I have failed in this. I've probably failed in it multiple times because I am a human, and therefore I am the bad guy in the story sometimes. But, I'd like to limit that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want the story of my life, or the story of my kid's life or my wife's life to include moments like this where they're like, yeah, I really could have used Jameson stepping up in that moment, but he was doing this or doing that, or he was just asleep, didn't notice, didn't step up. So I find it incredibly challenging, if that makes any sense. Because, in the story, you've got these big Titanic bad guys,
Mm-hmm.
Pontius Pilate, and the scribes and the priests, they're beating Jesus and crucifying him. And you've got Judas, who's a super sellout. Well, these guys aren't that. They just don't care enough to stay awake. I don't know. I'm going to beat the same point to death, but I feel like this is relatable.
No, I think it definitely is relatable. I mean, sometimes it's those more, I mean, that is a very everyday type of thing that we can do. We're not doing anything overtly, like actively trying to avoid what God is asking us to do in certain scenarios, but we are missing opportunities.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot. I mean, I think about those things, a lot, because it's like we have our head down, we have our focus on the thing we're doing, and we're missing all kinds of opportunities all around that we're essentially sleeping through.
Yeah.
In our daily lives. Now they're probably not as big as this, but they're probably pretty big in the people's lives we're missing out on them. So right. I think that's really important. And it's like, I mean, simple things like we're just supposed to love, but we're not always tuned into that.
Yeah, of course not.
And it's like, nah, I'm too busy for love right now. I'm like at work to do and stuff.
And then you get too tired for it. One of the things that I'm guilty of from time to time, my wife might say more than that, is I will take work pressure home.
Oh, yeah.
So there's been turmoil or conflict in my place of work, or something's not quite happening, or maybe it's just been a heavy load.
Yeah.
And so I get home at the end of the day, and I've had these days in recent months where, you get into an office, 7 o'clock, 8 at the latest. And then by 6 o'clock in the evening, you drag yourself home. And I mean, I've had times where like these long days, I didn't even take a bathroom break, or I didn't eat anything, just slammed through a hard day, constant work. And I get home and there's just nothing in the tank. So I've given the best of myself to, my job.
Right.
I get home. Now Kelly needs a break. My kids want dad to help with homework. There's all these moments. And I'm just like, hey, I need an hour where nobody talks to me.
Yeah.
Like, I need something to drink. I need something to eat. I need to sit here and put on some like headphone. I need to disengage for a little while.
Yeah.
And that's not always, it's sort of the same. It's kind of, your tank's empty. So now you're going to sort of sleepwalk through some other real important moments. And, it's probably really bad priorities.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I feel like I've heard this, but I mean, it's like you never really know the person you're going to interact with next, like where they're at in their story.
Yeah.
I mean, your family is one thing too, but it's like everyone really. I mean, every interaction, me on my worst day is probably not something that this person would need at their worst moment. They need me on my best day, So, I mean, there's a ton of application in what we just read. There's tons. And
it's a warning from the text. It's it's just a model I don't want to follow,
Right.
regarding those guys. And I think for those guys, for Peter, James, and John, if later in life, looking back, I'm sure they thought, oh man, how did I miss that?
Yeah.
So let's pivot now.
All right.
Let's pivot from Peter, James, and John. Let's talk about Jesus for a minute. So he got him in the garden. Of his 12 guys, one of them is actively currently betraying him and trying to hurt, kill, and destroy him. The 3 closest ones, well, they're not going that far, but they're just letting him down.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got, on top of getting crucified, tomorrow maybe, on top of that, and all that means spiritually, separation from the Father, and all the looking forward anxiety. You've also got all this personal stuff.
Right.
It's just like everything's being stripped away. These 12 guys who you've poured your life into, plus it's just like everything's just being cut away, and you're being left alone, and you're left let down, and you're left betrayed, and you're in a horrible place. Luke 22:44 gives us this detail. It says, being in anguish. I get that word anguish. Anguish is not like, oh, this is annoying. Like, anguish is utter, I can't deal with this pain. He prayed more fervently. Fervently is with deep emotion. And his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, just so you'll know, this is a real thing. Like, some people are like, you can't sweat blood. That's dumb. It's a real thing. I'm not a doctor, but I did look it up, on WebMD or something. I don't know, some medical website last night. And it says that it's called hematohidrosis.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a couple other names. Those don't matter. It says it's a condition in which capillary blood vessels that feed the sweat glands rupture, causing them to exude blood, occurring under conditions of extreme physical or emotional stress. The article went on to say acute fear and intense mental contemplation are the most frequent causes, as reported in 6 cases in men condemned to execution, and it kind of goes on from there. Okay? So this phenomena has been observed. It happens in the most extreme cases of emotional exhaustion and anguish. Okay? So what I want you to imagine is if you had been Peter, James, and John, and you had stayed awake. And it says he went at sort of a stone's throw away, but if you had sort of crept down the trail, the path, and you had come upon Jesus, what would you have seen? You'd have seen him on the ground, crying, probably convulsing, praying fervently, means with great emotion, begging, pleading with God, please, Lord, please, is there anything else we can do? You would not have said he was okay. No one would have been like, yeah, he's fine. No, he's okay. No, he wasn't. He wasn't. He was in horrific anguish. And I think sometimes we struggle with thinking about Jesus being pushed to that extreme, but it is clear from the text that he was. And again, this is what qualifies him to be our high priest that understands us, because he's been pushed to his extremity. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, I thank God. I thank God every day. I don't want to understand what these people go through, okay? But I have good friends who've lost children, and I have, good friends who've lost spouses, and, people that have been pushed to their extreme. And a part of what this all says to me is like, it's okay to not be okay.
Right.
It's okay to be in anguish. It's okay to be, again, when you get that diagnosis that you don't want to hear, to have extreme anxiety and fear, and it's okay. because if Jesus can be pushed to that, why can't I be pushed to it? I'm far, far less capable of handling myself than he was.
Right.
So it's okay. The question is, like, what do you do with it? What do you do with it?
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that there are two answers. There's two possibilities. And we've talked about this in other episodes, but maybe probably bears repeating. We talked about being disappointed by God, by Jesus in the episode about the Droughtful Entry. This is Jesus's moment of that exact thing, that he goes to the Lord in prayer. And he says, God, please take this away from me. And the Father says, no. Okay, this is Jesus. This is the equivalent of praying for that cure. Lord, please heal me. Lord, please heal my son. Lord, please heal my wife. And God's saying no. And, and we talked about, like, in the fact that he didn't perform a miracle for John the Baptist, and how he says, don't be offended because of me.
Right.
And how there was this choice that hung out there. You could be offended at the Lord and walk away from him. Like, I'm done with you. And that's an option. You can do it. Or you can do what Jesus does here in the garden and actually lean in closer. So Jesus goes where he goes, please take this from me. Please take this from me. And God says no. And he goes again, please take this from me. And he says no. And he prays all night, over and over again, finally landing on your will be done. Okay? And I think that's a real, normal, very human process, And in those moments where we are ultimately challenged, our choice is, do we lean into God? Do we pray and pray and pray? And over time, land on, okay, your will be done. I trust you. Or do we say, I'm out? I've had enough. And the thing is, I'm out. I've had enough. It really just doesn't work.
Right.
Because then you're still suffering. I mean, you've still got the cancer. Your kids still has whatever problem. Your marriage is still and now you just have no hope and no resource. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really work. I mean, it's the same thing with Jesus in this moment. I mean, was he really going to opt out? I mean, what's he going to do? Like, then he's made himself a liar because he's told, there's really, the opt out doesn't really work.
Right.
It's not really a good option, but that doesn't mean we don't need to be sort of comforted and caressed and moved into the place of accepting something. I mean, with our kids, that's what we do, right? I remember when my kids were little, they had to get, like shots, inoculations, they needed it. You don't want to get mumps, or whatever.
They didn't go down without a fight there.
No, they didn't. You'll be, oh yes, we're gonna go to the doctor. Are you going to get shot? Well, yeah, but it's for your good, And there's just like a process where you gotta, and depending on which kid of mine, some of them would be like, all right, they would kind of man or woman up, and then one of them, and I won't give any names, I can sell anybody out, but then some of them you just had to like just
hold
put them as, and which just makes it worse, but anyway, sometimes like with our kids, it's just, what's got to happen, what's for their good, and as a good parent, you try to like help them see it, help them understand it, and sometimes you just comfort them because it's not going to be good.
Right.
I remember, I don't know why I keep doing medical examples, but I remember I broke my finger when I was 13. It was bad. I broke it like all the way, it was mangled, just grotesque. And I mean, there's no question what the doctor has to do. He has to yank that thing back straight. And there's no question that's going to hurt real, real bad. And so there wasn't much my dad could do, but he went with me and he stood by the bed and he kept a hand on my leg. So I didn't kick the doctor probably, while the doctor, he didn't give me anything either. I don't know. Crazy
just
guy.
Yanked it back.
Oh, and it wasn't just a yank. It took like a minute and a half while he lined it up and you could hear it grind. It was awful, horrific. Sorry if you're sensitive, but but sometimes you're just there with It matters, and so I think with God, we can be the child who doesn't quite get it, doesn't quite understand it. And it may not be okay on this side of eternity. And it may really, really hurt. It may be really awful. But we lean in and say, okay, I trust that you have a purpose and a plan in this. And if it's a no, then I guess there's a reason. If Paul got a no to his prayer, if Jesus got a no to his prayer, John the Baptist had to go to his death, then I probably don't outrank those guys. So, all right. And I'm going to pray real hard and land in a place where I trust you. I hope. And I think that that's what Jesus, one of the things he teaches us through all this thing is that that's kind of, that's kind of where it is, this swirl of awful happens to us. You'll have your place of crushing too. And what's on the inside is going to come out, whether, it's good, healthy olive oil or something gross is going to come out. What are you on that day? And does your faith hold up? Can you lean into God? And it's a testimony to the world. If on those days you can lean into God and find a way to trust him and walk it out, then everyone around you will see it and be blessed by it. I know plenty of people who their testimony is, well, this person always said they believed in Jesus, but I saw how they acted when their son died. I saw they acted when whatever, and I became a believer because of it. If it worked then it works. And we bless, and if you on that day, prove that your faith isn't, that's going to have a result too. And for us, we look at Jesus and the fact that he went to his place of crushing, and he bore up under such. Then we're all blessed by it, right? So I guess kind of where it lands. Do you want to be a blessing or not? Do you want to be authentic or not? Do you want to choose to trust the Lord? Even when your best friends let you down, even when you're in that bad place. So that's kind of where it goes.
No, that's great. And I think, there's so many things that Jesus models for us. And this is one of those things of like giving permission to feel the full range of emotion in those difficult times. And there's so many things throughout Scripture that he's doing and giving us permission and showing a new light on, or how do I interact with this person, or is it okay to do X, Y, Z? How should I treat this person even though they're outside of this group and all that?
Yeah, and one of the worst things Christians will sometimes say really horrible, hurtful things to people in this situation.
Right.
They'll throw again Romans 8:28 at them or something, and be like, "Oh, cheer up, it's going to be good." No, it's not. Not right now. Not for a long time.
Right.
It's like we think like somehow if you're Christian, if you have real faith, then you should somehow be able to keep a stiff upper lip and keep your chin up. And it's like, are you kidding me?
Yeah, man, this is a great. That's how I received it. It's like it gives you permission to have the full range of emotions and get whatever it takes to get to that. Your will be done is okay,
and God can handle it.
Right.
He's not going to be put off by your fear, your anger, your disappointment. Like he already knows. You can express it.
Yeah,
it'll be all right.
Yeah,
and then you work through it.
Yeah. Well, that was good. Thanks for unpacking that for us. So that's Gethsemane, and that wraps up this episode.
All right.
So where are we next? So the next one will be going to St. Peter and Gallicantu is our next episode.
It's the prison /court. That's where Jesus goes to be tried by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. Not very nice guys.
And as a teaser, Gallicantu means
crowing rooster.
Crowing rooster. Dun dun dun.
Singing chicken. As if you try a literal translation, I think, but I just whatever.
That's great. All right. Well, that's it for this episode. And as always, stick with us on this Passion Week series. And if you want to find out more about what we're doing and other content we have, go to thelandandthebible.com.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. And if you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandinthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.